Just out of curiosity, how many people here have read Catch-22? How many people read it at a young age and didn't like it? Well, that's an interesting point because I know when I first found the book in 1963, when I was the night before I left for what turned out to be my war, and I bought the book because it had a B-25 on the cover. I was buying a bunch of paperbacks today, and when I first read it, it made very little sense. And then I came back from the war and I went to college, and in my literature class, the novel we had to read was Catch-22, which I thought was pretty good. I thought, well, I've read it before, I know it was good. It was a very different book. And most of my classmates who hadn't been in the service, it made little sense to them, but it made perfect sense to me, and it made perfect sense to my professor, who was a former bombardier in the 15th Air Force. That's because I had a friend of mine who bought my book, and he decided before he would read it that he would reread Catch-22 because he hated it when he was in high school. And he posted up on his review of the book. He said, so I read Catch-22 after 24 years in the education establishment, and it's my new favorite novel. Joe Heller always said that Catch-22 was set in a war, but it wasn't about the war. And that's true, it wasn't about the war. Catch-22 is a story about how a person with a sense of morality exists in an organization that doesn't have any. Everybody's had that moment where doing the right thing is impossible because it's against the rules. Catch-22 actually doesn't, there is no Catch-22, although it was originally Catch-18. When Heller wrote the novel, his original title was Catch-18. The publisher got ready to publish it in 1961 and found out that Leon Uris was publishing Mila 18, and they decided that they couldn't possibly have two books with 18 in the title. So they asked him to change it, and he just plucked 22 out of the air. There's a real story about Catch-22. Joe Heller served in the 340th Bomb Group on Corsica. He was there from May 1944 to January 1945, and there was three groups there. There was the 310th Bomb Group, the 321st Bomb Group, and the 340th, and they ended up winning the war in Italy, and nobody knows it. For 50 years, they've lived in the shadow of the novel, and everybody reads the novel and thinks that's the history, but it's not. What had happened after June of 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy, Italy was a thoroughly secondary theater. The Americans never wanted to be there to begin with. After they took Sicily and had control of the Mediterranean, they were perfectly happy to take everybody and send them up to England and get ready to invade France. The British wanted to fight in Italy, and they said, and they finally made their, you can't give the Germans a free pass for a year. So they decided that they would in fact invade Italy. The Germans managed to make the Americans pay for every square inch of Italy, from Salerno up to the Apennines. The final line was in the Apennines in northern Italy, just south of Bologna, south of Venice. It had been designed by Rommel, and it was because he thought that was where, if they were going to defend Italy, they should do it right there from the get-go. It was a series of interlocking bunkers and pillboxes and high in the Alps. And by the fall of 1944, the Allied armies had fought themselves out trying to break through and couldn't. The German quartermaster general made a report to the commander on the 1st of November that said, we're getting 28,000 tons of supplies a day arriving every 30 minutes on trains that take 8 hours to come from Munich to Bologna through the Brenner Pass. It's 600% of what we need, and as long as we get that, we can hold out forever. 5 days later, the first mission of Operation Bingo was flown against the against the transformers. It was an electric train that was running. And they knocked out the transformers, which forced the Germans to bring coal-fired locomotives from elsewhere in the Third Reich to do it. And they proceeded over the next 6 months to bomb the Brenner Pass. They had to go back to places every day because they had to knock it down faster than the Germans could build it back up. And 6 months later, at the end of March of 1945, the German Quartermaster General made the report that they had gotten 2,800 tons of supplies that month, that the pass had been closed, the rail line had been closed for half of the month. It was 40% of what they needed. And 9 days later, the Allied Army began their offensive with the spring thaw. And 20 days later, the German general who had fought the Allies from Salerno to Bologna surrendered 2 weeks earlier than the rest of the Germans. And it was because of these guys. And it's a story that nobody knows. And I was, while I was writing this, I talked to a friend of mine, a retired Air Force colonel, and I said, you know, this is the most successful battlefield interdiction bombing campaign the Air Force ever did, and nobody knows about it. And he said, well, Tom, you know, it's illegal for the Air Force to ever admit that they helped the Army. But the story, they would go in, the Brenner Pass is 4,000 feet at its highest altitude, and it's in the Alps, and on either side are mountains going up to 10,000 feet. These guys went in at 8,000 to 9,000 feet, and the Germans had guns as high as 6,000 feet. It was big. When I got through writing the book after talking to the guys, and I was reading through it, and I suddenly said to myself, what those 70 missions they flew were 70 charges of the Light Brigade. So I put the third verse of the Charge of the Light Brigade in the opening of the book, because that's what happened. I mean, they went into Rovereto, which was the narrowest part of the pass. They could only go one direction. So the Germans knew everything was set. And the Germans had 488 millimeter guns in the pass. At the beginning, they had 550 at the end of the thing. One of the navigators showed me this flak map, and the red dots around the place where they knew where there was flak. And then there was the Brenner Pass, and there was an inch wide red line. And Paul Young told me that the problem was you'd be flying along and you'd come to an area where you'd gotten the hell shot out of you the day before, you'd get all tight, and nothing would happen. And you'd be flying along for another 5 minutes, and all of a sudden you'd be surrounded by flak because they moved the guns. And he finally, as he said, finally got to the point where you were just tight from the moment you got in the airplane to the moment you got out of the airplane. The interesting thing was I put a search on for Joe Heller, and found a very interesting thing happened. He flew his first mission May 29, 1944. By August 23rd, he'd flown 38 missions. They flew about every other day. And while he was interviewed after the novel was out, he always said that he only flew milk runs. But the interesting thing was that of those 38 missions, 35 of them, according to the descriptions in the war diary, were not milk runs. They were hot missions. And then, between the 24th of August of 44 and the end of January 45, he flew 20 missions, an average of one a week. And only one of those was hot. A mission in September to bomb a German cruiser, an Italian cruiser in Spezia Harbor. And he's there, he's flying milk runs, and all of the war diary, in the middle of the Brenner Pass campaign, all the war diaries are talking about milk runs are hard to find and harder to fly. But he's flying them. You have to ask yourself, what happened? August 24th, things change. Well, on August 24th, they flew, the picture I showed you of the bridge, they flew a mission to bomb the town of Ponte San Martino, a town of 2,500 people. Its only value was the fact that it had grown up since 55 BC by that bridge. People came across the bridge and went to the market. It had no military value, there were no guns, there was nothing in the town. And but what they were told to do was they were told they were bombing the bridges, But when the lead bombardier got there, he found that what was in the bomb site was the town, and that he almost called the lead bombardier said 60 years later that he almost called the mission off, that he thought something had been done wrong. And it was the one mission that bothered him through all the time after. But the 18 planes bombed the town. 250 people were killed. 40 of them were children who were in the elementary school that was hit. One airplane rose out of formation and dropped its bombs in the field. And when they got back to Corsica, the pilot said that he was evading flak. There wasn't any flak. There were no guns. It was a court-martial offense to go out of the formation once you're on the initial point, and you didn't break the formation for flak or for anything. Nobody in his crew contradicted him. Nobody in the rest of the mission contradicted him. Joe Heller was flying that guy's wing. In the war diaries, you find after that, well, in most of the missions, they talk about before the mission why we're doing it. It's in there. There's nothing. It's just they're going to go bomb the bridge. And then there's all this discussion afterwards about why they had to do it. They were to turn the town into rubble to block a German division advancing to the front. The rubble missions were flown quite frequently in Italy. They were the missions that these guys hated. If you're bombing a city from 25,000 feet in the B-17, you pretty much don't see anything. If you're bombing from 5,000 feet, you can see what's happening. They hated these missions. And what happened was, during that period of time, just before that mission, they ended up having missions. Their mission total went from 50 to 70 in the 340th bomb. The reason why was they weren't getting replacements. This is why but for the guys, for a 21-year-old first lieutenant who's the sum total of what he knows about the war is that he has got to climb in the airplane for 50 times. You can pretty much get to the point where you think they're out to get me, and it's them that are doing it. They're the ones that are changing it. Generals don't go tell first lieutenants why they're doing something, but the reason was they weren't getting any replacements because they were the secondary theater. But the week before that mission, 3 officers and 2 enlisted men said, we've flown 50 missions, we're not flying anymore. The 2 sergeants got thrown in the stockade, and 3 officers got put in half. They had to stay in their tents, and then finally the commanding general of the 12th Air Force rescinded the punishment, told the commanding general of the 57th Bomb Wing, you can't do that. So all of a sudden, the leadership of the bomb wing has now got the top end of the Air Force looking at it. So if anybody was going to complain about this mission, things could be troublesome for the bureaucracy. So all of a sudden, Joe Heller doesn't fly missions. He's got a reputation in the group up to that point of being a loudmouth about things. And all of a sudden, other researchers say, who didn't find what I found. The other researchers said, for some reason, he stops talking. Well, he didn't stop talking. He got another job. Wilbur Blue, who's a picture of him, who was a pre-war documentary filmmaker and was a bombardier in the group, had been picked by the colonel who commanded the group to make documentaries about the group so he could brown nose with his superiors about all the superior things they were doing. And Wilbur Blue got an assignment at the beginning of September of '44 to do a documentary called Training in Combat, about replacement air crews coming to the group, getting special training before they applied their first mission. The film they worked on it off and on from September till just before Christmas, and the actors were people taken from the group. Joe Heller always said that there were no photographs taken of him during the war because it wasn't very photogenic, except there's about 45 pictures of Pete, a young replacement bombardier, in the film, and that's Joe Heller. And that's what they were doing. Now, What happened? Well, in the novel, you find at the end of chapter 29 and the beginning of chapter 30, you find beat for beat the story of the bombing of Satima Bridge, the argument about they're arguing and in the movie it's there too. They're arguing why are we bombing a town of no significance? And in the novel, the colonel comes in and listens to him and he says, well, you know, the general and I go to a lot of effort to get you guys these milk runs. Now, if you don't want one, just let us know. We can send you back to Bologna. It's not a problem at all. Just let me know. And everybody's quiet. They're thinking, you know, do I bomb a village of people I don't know where there's no chance of me getting hurt? Or do I go back to a town where I might get killed? The moral quandary that a person faces. And then, Yossarian, Heller's alter ego, is the lead bombardier. He almost calls off the mission. And his buddy Dunbar flies off and drops the bombs in the field. Yossarian proceeds then to start arguing that he won't fly any more missions. And then all of a sudden he gets called in and they say, hey, like us, be our pal, be our friend, we'll take care of you. In the novel he says yes, and then he steps outside and he gets knifed in the back, and then he says no and ends up in the raft. But I think that what happened was that Joe Heller said yes, and he did those missions. And he left with 60 missions at a time when they're supposed to fly 70. And everything I've read, I've found out about him from talking to people who knew him over the years. He was as one friend of mine said, he's a Jewish kid from Brooklyn who grew up in the 30s with a socially active family. What do you think he had for morality? Well, he had the feeling that what he'd done was a moral failure. Although, interestingly enough, every one of the guys that I talked to said, if you'd have given me the chance to get off on missions, I'd have taken it. And writers, we're the kind of a friend of mine in Hollywood said, actors are people who dislike themselves so much that they want to be somebody else. Directors want to be dictator of the world. And writers are so angry they want to create an alternative universe. Well, a writer can create an alternative universe. And that's what Catch-22 is. Catch-22 is Heller doing the right thing, eventually. What he came to see is right. But the novel has nothing to do with Vietnam. He wrote it between 1952 and 1959. And for anybody who wasn't around then, I can assure you that the word Vietnam was nowhere in the language. But what it was the war in Italy was a war that was fought because it was there. It didn't have, after Normandy, after they took Rome, it didn't have a higher purpose other than it was there. And that comes through in the story. And by 1965, when I read it in college, and I came back from a war that had no higher purpose. That's why the novel ended up connecting. They were, the average age was, George was 19 when he was there as a gunner. Joe Heller arrived there the month he turned 21. Sterling Ditchy turned 21 on his way to flying there. Tom Cahill was the oldest one. He was 24. The oldest one of the people that are in the book. But the guys who were running the show were in their 30s. General Knapp, who was the commander, Knapp never forgave Heller for creating the character of General Treadle, because the two couldn't have been further apart. When Knapp was 10 years old, the Wright brothers stayed at his house for 6 weeks. He'd been involved in aviation since he was 20. He'd been involved in military aviation longer than most of the guys who were flying for him had been alive. In 1940, when the B-25 was first new, he was put in charge of training the air crews for the B-25. He trained the guys who eventually became the Doolittle Raiders. And he trained the 6 groups. The 3 groups went to the Pacific, 3 groups went to the Mediterranean. And he said, and when it came time in late 42 to go, he said, I want to lead one of the groups that I trained. And they said, no, you can't do that. You're 44 years old. You're too old. Well, he called up his old friend Hap Arnold, who he'd been flying with for 20 years, who was the commander of the Air Force, and he got that rule, got that changed, and he flew. He went out there when they flew in North Africa. He flew the 44 toughest missions that the group flew, that his group flew. If it was a tough mission, he was there in front of it. And the guys who were there then loved it. Tough but fair was the terminology. Well, by the time Joe Heller got there in May of 44, Colonel Knapp was General Knapp since January, and he was distant figure. And you know, first lieutenants, 21-year-old first lieutenants don't talk to him. The only time anybody saw him was when he showed up to give medals. But at the same time, they never realized that the food that they were getting, which was pretty good, was due to him. I mean, they were living in tents on Corsica. Out in the War Diaries, one of the War Diaries was a big event. We finally got the new latrines. They're really good. And then another point, we have hot showers for the first time since we've been here. But they're living in tents, and they're living in tents through the coldest winter in Europe in a century. And life was not good. Sunny Italy wasn't very sunny. So he was a very different guy than General Treatle. For that, all they knew about the general was we're getting more missions. We're not seeing replacements. It's his fault. I ended up telling the story of these guys who saved the war in Italy, and nobody knows about it. And it's been the best book I've had the chance to write, to be able to tell this story. But anyway, George Underwood is one of the members of the guild.